Hey there, for today's unproduced video, I'm going to be going a little ranty because I'm going to be talking about the United States defense budget. And today I'm going to present 10 reasons why the US defense budget is absolutely insane. This is prompted by yesterday's announcement from the Biden administration that they were going to seek $813 billion for a single year of U.S. defense spending for the 2023 fiscal year Pentagon budget. $813 billion. For comparison's sake, this is up from budgets in the 700 billions throughout the Trump administration and last year. And during the Obama administration, it was in like the 500 billions. So this is a tremendous, tremendous jump. To be clear, this is all preliminary. This is just what Joe Biden is proposing, and most things that Joe Biden proposes in his budget aren't going to happen. All the nice things about the deficit, all the goodies for sort of more liberals, what have you, that's all probably going to disappear and isn't going to make it past Congress. No tax hikes, nothing about the environment, nothing about pandemic preparedness. No, that'll all get stopped by the Congress. But the defense budget, this isn't like the ceiling, this is the floor. This means that in 2023, we're going to be spending at least $813 billion. Usually Congress adds more money on top of it. So maybe it'll be like $850 billion, which is absolutely insane. So without further ado, 10 reasons why I find this insane. First off, I want to talk about one of the most common arguments that's made in favor of spending this idiotic amount of money on defense spending. And this is the idea that, well, you know, and this is true, that actually as a percentage of GDP, we're not spending as much on our defense spending as we did at the height of the Cold War or during World War II. This is apparently an argument that people make. It's about 3% of GDP today, and during the 1980s, with Reagan's defense spending push, it did hit 5%. During the 1960s, Vietnam, it was at like 8%, and during World War II, it was at like 11% of GDP. Well, there's the really obvious objection that I'll get into in great detail later on in this video, is that we don't have any threats that are anywhere near on the scale of the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany. So we probably don't need to be spending this money. This idea that we should just automatically be spending 5% of our GDP on defense contracts when we don't actually have an enemy, that defense contracts are worthwhile, are useful to fight, is insane, but we'll get more into that later. But I think we need to just address what people are really arguing when they want us to go back to 1980s or 1950s defense spending. What they are arguing is for is the evisceration of Social Security and Medicare, because these time periods in US history, the 1950s, the 1980s, were periods before large-scale social spending by the US government. So basically, people who want GDP percentage of defense spending to go above 3% want to take money away from your grandma. They want you to not have money in retirement through Social Security. They want your grandparents' medical care to not be paid for. Social Security dates back to the 1940s. And Medicare, the most valuable, the social program that pays for all of the medical care of anybody in the United States over the age of 65 with some qualifications, that program dates back to the 1960s. So even in the 1980s, even though both of these programs were in existence, were accumulating liabilities, they were nowhere near of the size that they are today, because our population of seniors, blessedly, this is a good thing, our population of seniors is much larger now than it used to be, than it was in the 1980s, or certainly in the 1950s, before Medicare even existed. So people who are saying, let's go back to where our GDP, 5% of GDP is spent on defense spending, are basically saying, let's rob grandma. That's what that argument is. So yeah, the fact that we're spending less as a percentage of GDP on defense than we were during the height of the Cold War and World War II is a bad argument, and it's not something that anybody should take at all seriously. Spending more on defense spending hurts seniors and is already hurting seniors. It is already attacking the core of the social spending agreements that are, the third rail of U.S. politics. Defense spending is already attacking that. It's not a coincidence that George W. Bush, the guy who drove our defense spending up the most after the Cold War, also wanted to rip apart Social Security because that was the only way we were going to pay for the amount of insane defense spending that George W. Bush wanted to do. He found a different way, or rather we found as a country, we found a different way of spending for defense spending other than eviscerating Social Security and Medicare the way that George W. Bush wanted to. And this brings us to part two, which is interest rates. The way that we figured out to pay for all this meaningless, useless war on terror garbage and all these defense contracts that have brought us nothing but pain and humiliation over the past 20 years, the way we did it was by printing money. And we've been in this very interesting situation since the 2008 financial crisis, and to some degree even before that, since the 1980s, where interest rates in the United States were low. We just didn't need to pay much interest on the money that the government borrowed. Interest rates were super low. That's ending. As I think anybody watching this is aware, inflation has reared its ugly head in the United States for the first time since, in a serious way, in the most serious way, since the 1980s. So we're gonna have to start hiking up interest rates. This means that the money printing era, the we can spend money on everything forever for nothing, is over. I'm not like an insane fiscal hawk about this. I don't believe that budget deficits are the be all and end all or what have you. But I do believe there's a reality to this. There is a reality to the national debt. There is a reality to budget deficits. There will come a point when we're spending too much. That point may have already arrived. That point may arrive when interest rates start to go up, and interest rates are beginning to go up, and they are expected to go up massively in the coming year. So we can't spend money like this anymore. And if we continue to spend this kind of idiotic money on the Defense Department with interest rates where they are, we're gonna have to start making choices. We're gonna have to start sacrificing grandma's health care to make Raytheon or McDonnell Douglas or Lockheed Martin or any of these defense contractors richer. That's all we're doing here. They love the public relations. There is a bigger bump for the pay of actual soldiers in this proposed budget, and that's very nice. But you have to understand that's a tiny rounding error. That thing that they're going to use to sell this defense budget, pump up this, we're giving a historically large raise to our soldiers. Yes, we're giving a historically large raise to our soldiers. We should do that. We could do that with a handful of billions of dollars. So we're giving a large raise to our soldiers, which doesn't cost very much, and we are giving an obscene, absurd handout to companies like Raytheon and Lockheed Martin that are already experiencing an incredible bonanza because of Russia's stupidity in Europe. And that brings us to number 3, which is Russia is a joke. For at least 15 years now, we've been taught that, Putin has brought Russia up from its knees and it's turned it into a top-scale military threat. They're a big deal. They're a near-peer competitor. They're definitely really threatening the United States. We have to worry about all the things that they do. And I believe this. I believe this to some extent. And I'm pretty cynical about what the U.S. government tells us. But as we're seeing in Ukraine, the abject humiliation of the Russian military in Ukraine has shown all of this to be a joke. Before Ukraine, I thought I was being somewhat iconoclastic by saying, you know what, I bet that if Russia tried to invade Poland, I bet they'd get their ass kicked. And that was when I was assuming that Russia had a real military. Now I think that if Russia tried to invade Estonia, it would probably get its ass kicked. Russia has a 20th century military that is currently being ripped to shreds. It is not a threat. And this was one of the pillars of the Pentagon's self-justification, the great power competition, this idea that the Pentagon needed to be given more and more and more money to deal with Russia and China. Russia has essentially been dealt with. Sure, there's definitely needs to be more spending on Javelin and Stinger missiles or what have you. Yes, we need to replace those stocks, keep giving them to the Ukrainians, but this is not a broadening theater of U.S. interest. This is a theater of U.S. interest that is closing down, which of course brings us to number 4. The fourth reason the U.S. defense budget is insane: Europe is spending more. The fact that Russia is a joke as a military competitor, is no competitor to the United States, does not keep them from being somewhat threatening to the other not very militarily significant countries on Russia's border. So all of them have opted to start spending a ton of money. To the extent that Russia has any real threat, presents any real threat, Poland, Germany, France, let them handle it. They are now, after 30 years of us telling them to spend more on defense, they're spending money on defense. We should get a bonus from that. We should be able to cut the amount of money we spend on defense. So Europe is spending more, so we should be able to spend less. Number 5, the Middle East circle jerk is over. This is extraordinary. The amount of money, I think we were at least spending tens of billions, if not 100 of billions of dollars every year maintaining that ridiculous fake country that we had set up, that ridiculous fake government that we had set up to control Afghanistan. It was washed away last year. The United States is entirely out of Afghanistan. We should have gotten a tens of billions or even 100 billion peace dividend out of that. Nope. Instead, we're actually going up by about the cost of an annual war in Afghanistan. It's insane. The U.S. presence in Syria and Iraq is very small, and very small in terms of boots on the ground, in terms of physical people, but it requires an extraordinary expenditure, arming and propping up the Syrian Kurds, the Syrian Democratic Forces, or whatever they call themselves, providing all of the missile defense and whatnot you need to defend 20 guys sitting in Iraq to no purpose. It probably costs $1 billion to maintain a base in Iraq every year, and we've got I don't know, half a dozen. All of that can be gone. The only thing that our presence in the Middle East is doing is it's a self-generating problem. We need defense. We need to spend a ton of money defending U.S. troops that we've put there. Just take them out. There's no purpose to anything that we're doing in the Middle East right now other than antagonizing Iran, a truly insignificant country in terms of, I mean, it's got a great history, yada, yada, what have you, but it means nothing to the United States other than the potential for a $3 trillion waste of a war. Basically, the defense contractors that have too much power over the Pentagon budget desperately want us to go from our $1 trillion war in Afghanistan to our $1 trillion war in Iraq to a $1 trillion war in Iran. The money that we're giving to the Pentagon to maintain our Middle East thing, it's a trap. It's a trap for the U.S. taxpayer. We are helping the Pentagon maintain a sword of Damocles over our heads. If we just get out of there, we won't have another $1 trillion war with Iran. The Middle East playtime is over. It's beyond parity at this point. The biggest thing we did in the Middle East over the past 10 years was defeat the Islamic State, which was basically an out-of-control U.S. proxy. That we'd opened this massive space for jihadists to fight the Syrian government, the secular Syrian government, and one of the clubs of jihadists got out of control. That's what the Islamic State was. We created that whole reason for being there. We've solved that problem. Get out. Let's get out of there. Anyway, nuclear modernization is entirely unnecessary. Well, perhaps that's incorrect to say. So this is number 6, nuclear modernization. It's perhaps incorrect to say that this is entirely unnecessary. The United States has one of the most terrifying instruments of mass death humanity has ever conceived, our nuclear force, our nuclear weapons force. Now, our nuclear weapons force absolutely needs to be scrupulously maintained. That's important. We do need to spend billions, even tens, or maybe even $100 billion on maintaining this nuclear force over the next 10 years. But that's not what we're doing. We're spending $1 trillion over the next 10 years. At least $1 trillion. That's the estimate, that we're going to spend $1 trillion expanding our nuclear weapons force, coming up with new kinds of weapons, inventing new ways to wipe out all of humanity, even though the weapons we currently have could wipe out all of humanity a dozen times over. It is absolutely insane. And by doing this, we convince Russia, a country that can barely maintain a tank, that it has to continue pouring money into its also insane mass death weapons in Russia. So there's no good reason to be doing this nuclear expansion. They call it modernization. It's not to make it seem like, oh, we're just doing maintenance. No. It is nuclear expansion that we are spending $1 trillion on over the next 10 years. To be clear, I mean, that's $1 trillion, 10 years, the math more or less. So about an eighth, about 100 billion of this insane, obscene $100 billion we're spending, sort of $800 billion we're spending on the US military next year, about an eighth of it is going to be nuclear weapons expansion, which is insane. People will tell you, well, the Chinese are expanding their nuclear weapons too. Yes, of course they are. But if the Chinese spend 10 years expanding their nuclear weapons, their number of nuclear weapons, their ways of delivering nuclear weapons, they're still going to have a nuclear weapons force about the fifth the size of ours. The current estimates today are that the US nuclear force is somewhere between 20 and 100 times larger than China's. It's absolutely true that China, because of all the threats we make against it, feels like it needs to pour more money into its nuclear weapons. But even the most insane estimates of how much money they're going to pour into this, into creating more weapons of death in China, get it to a point 10 years from now where it's still like a fifth the size of the US nuclear weapons force. The nuclear modernization thing is boring, and it's mostly controlled by a bunch of companies and experts who love burying it in all kinds of jargon and whatnot. But it may even be the worst scandal of everything we're talking about today. It's absolutely insane. The China war. I agree that the United States does have to pour money into competing with China. Actually, I think I'm a lot more serious about that than anybody at the Pentagon, frankly. But what we're spending money on in this obscene $800 billion defense budget for 2023 is not actually things that are going to be useful in a fight with China. Donald Trump and Joe Biden have done their absolute best to start a war with China. We have troops on Taiwan. This was the reddest of red lines for China. This was announced in October of 2021. The Wall Street Journal got this information. Oh my gosh, we've got US troops on Taiwan. You know, strategic ambiguity seems to have fallen. What are we going to do? Well, neither the US nor the Chinese governments have talked about this, referenced this detail at all since. They want us to forget it, because it's quite clear that the idea that China is going to invade Taiwan in the next decade is fantasy. It is propaganda that actually serves both the Chinese government and the US government, which is mostly an appendage of the defense industry. It's propaganda that it's simply not going to happen. This is even more the case after China has seen how disastrous Russia's Ukraine adventure has gone for it, how disastrously Russia's Ukraine adventure has gone for them. So it's just simply not going to happen. So what we're doing is we're building out all kinds of crap that's going to be falling apart by the time an actual war starts in the 2030s. And don't get me wrong, I believe the chances of a real US-China war are very real, and they are in the 2030s. And what we need to be doing now is giving a couple tens of billions of dollars more to DARPA to sort of figuring out what that conflict in the far future might look like. What we desperately don't need to be doing is be pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into missile pincushions like the Navy's plan for 500 ships or more aircraft carriers or frickin' fighter jets like it's 1945. We need drones, we need missiles, we need electronic warfare, and we need to spend, if we spend about a tenth of what we are spending on useless World War II era weaponry on those sorts of things in a research perspective, we'd be much better served than we would be by the current defense budget. Yeah, that's number 7. Like, none of the crap that we are spending we'll be spending $700 billion on next year, $800 billion on next year, will be at all useful for the eventual physical war with China. This is even more irresponsible, this is number 8, when you consider that real China competition is actually spooling up. It's time. There are aspects of the world that have been proven to be much more unipolar than we thought, with Russia being, turning out to be a joke and not a real competitor. The JV team was it Obama who described them as a JV team, or was he talking about the Islamic State? With Russia being proved to be a joke, it's actually a much more unipolar world than we thought. But what's interesting about this conflict and the humiliation of Russia is the way that it's highlighting that actually the global South, or the non-aligned, or most of the rest of the world isn't quite as on board with the US and Europe's humiliation of Russia as we might like. We need to start selling. We don't need to build more weapons. We are so far ahead of everybody else militarily that it's unimaginable. What we need to do is get to a point where the rest of the world doesn't think that's as scary as they do right now. We need to woo the world. We need to sell the world on US leadership. We need diplomacy. We need to put more money into making the rest of the world like us instead of just fear us. I think there was a great quote from Mattis, a very respected general who worked for Donald Trump, dramatically lessening everyone's respect for him. But he had pointed out that he desperately needs, as a military expert, he desperately needs a fully funded State Department. He desperately needs a diplomacy, because military figures can win, and I believe the United States can win any war anywhere in the world, but it can't win dozens. And without diplomacy, with diplomacy as bad as we've had over the past 20 years, the chances of our magnificent military weapons being committed everywhere at once are very high. That's actually something that Washington, D.C. seems to be actively trying for right now, with our ongoing Europe conflict, ongoing Middle East conflicts, and attempts to start ongoing Asian conflicts. Any sensible military person knows we need diplomacy. I believe the proposed budget, and this is from Biden, the proposed budget is somewhere around $60 billion for the State Department. Keep in mind, this isn't, this is every embassy, every diplomatic figure, every research component that we have comes to about $60 billion. And that, unlike the military budget where the $813 billion is the floor, and we're going to go up from there. The sort of $67 billion, don't quote me on that, that was proposed for diplomacy, that's the ceiling. That's as far that the Congress is going to just whittle away at that. Maybe it'll end up being less than Biden asked for. Diplomacy is sort of falling away. There's really important things that we need to do within the United States to compete with China. We need an industrial policy. I don't know exactly what that would look like. It's something that's very easy to screw up, but we do need to think more seriously about how we protect and enhance our manufacturing sector. We need to think more seriously about how do we get more skilled people to come in here. For all of the history of the United States was a beacon for skilled, risk-happy, folks who really wanted to go somewhere where they could show what they can do. Donald Trump largely broke that. We need to restart the immigration engine that is at the core of the United States. This is probably the most important thing that we need to do to compete with China in the decades to come. There's no money for that, obviously. There's no money for industrial policy. I mean, there's a little bit of money for industrial policy. That is growing a little under the Biden administration, and even some Republicans are on board with that as well. But it's pennies. It is a rounding error compared to the amount of money we're putting into, like I said, World War II era weaponry. That's what most of this $800 billion is going towards. World War II era weaponry like fighter jets and tanks and aircraft carriers that are just going to be missile pincushions and, multi-billion dollar art projects on the bottom of the South China Sea when the real conflict starts. What we need to do is make sure that we are extraordinarily better positioned for the real conflict, which means bringing manufacturing back to the United States, which means wooing the rest of the world with diplomacy, which means convincing the rest of the world that we are the good guys versus China. That shouldn't be hard to do. It's a crazy authoritarian state, but the United States has done such a terrible job over the past 30 years in selling our leadership and concepts like democracy and freedom that it's a real competition between the United States and China in diplomacy right now. It is not a real competition in military material. So we should be focusing on the diplomacy. There's so many things we could be spending money on better to compete with China than another fucking aircraft carrier. Real security threats. Let's talk about real security threats. Over the past 2 years, the world has experienced a real security threat, a real national security issue. It was a virus. It was not some country. It was not some terrorist. It was a virus. The coronavirus has absolutely changed everything about human society. In the early days, it was possible to be optimistic in very big ways. Finally a real threat that the whole world is facing together. What an extraordinary thing. What an extraordinary opportunity for solidarity. What an extraordinary opportunity to focus on things that actually matter, like our medical infrastructure, like goosing spending on research and development that can actually contribute to health and lifespan, and all these amazing things that looked kind of possible in the face of this incredible crisis that had shown how useless all of our traditional national security spending was. Obviously, I was an idiot to think that there'd be any kind of positive movement on that. Here we are 2 years into a debilitating pandemic, and we recently learned that actually the additional money appropriated to improve pandemic preparedness, so the United States wouldn't be as humiliated as it was in 2020, all that money apparently isn't making it through Congress. That's a different scandal that you can research and look into. So we can spend all this money on aircraft carriers. We can spend all this money on fighter jets, essentially useless missile pincushions, but we can't spend another $10 to $50 billion on pandemic preparedness, when of course it is the pandemic that cut every world economy out at the knees to the cost of countless trillions of dollars, loss of millions of lives. But no, we're still more focused on the idea that maybe in a decade or two we'll be able to fight a sort of half-assed simulacrum of the Battle of Midway against China. Maybe, yeah, it's a fantasy. But that's what we spend money on, not real security threats. Not real security threats, like this is number 10, like climate change. There's some money in Biden's budget, the budget he proposed yesterday for climate stuff. That'll all be gone by the time Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema get their hands on it. There's no that money's actually not going to make it through Congress, but the money for defense contracts will. Climate change is something that I believe is happening and that we need to change our energy systems to deal with. I know there's some people who in the audience who don't believe that. But what I think everyone in the audience can see is that moving as far towards solar and wind and nuclear and geothermal and hydropower, moving as far away from fossil fuels as we possibly can is one of the most important national security things that the United States could do. If we move away from fossil fuels, we become less dependent on the rest of the world. We are not, in fact, energy independent. Up until a couple weeks ago, we were buying a whole bunch of oil from Russia. We also have an interest in countries like Saudi Arabia, that is the country most responsible for 9/11, or Russia, the country that's doing really nasty shit in Ukraine right now, have less power. And the way to get them to have less power is to use fewer fossil fuel sources. And there's so much easy low-hanging fruit here. For the price of a single aircraft carrier, we could probably put up, I don't know what the details on this, but high-tension electricity lines that can get power from our deserts to places that they're more useful. There's just so many easy things that we could do with the $800 billion that we are pissing away on the chance to fight a big fight against Iran or the chance to fight a big fight against Russia. That money could be so much better used by creating alternative energy sources that would mean that nobody would ever have to fight against Iran or Russia ever again because they wouldn't have the resources. Anyway, so yeah, that's 10 reasons why the proposed 2023 Pentagon budget is absolutely insane. And of course, this doesn't just apply to the 2023 budget, it applies to the 2022 budget as well. And really every budget since the Cold War, every defense budget since the Cold War. It's just an insane waste of money. And I'm not saying that it needs to go down to zero. No, I think like probably $400 billion. I think $400 billion would be a good Pentagon place to start. And then that money that could do other things, strengthen the United States in other ways, could potentially get us to a world where even lower defense budgets seem to make sense. Because a lot of this money, a lot of this $800 billion, well, at least, hundreds of millions of dollars of it are spent on actually convincing the US public that the Pentagon is useful. The more money we give to the Pentagon, the more money that the Pentagon spews out to cable news, to universities, to think tanks, to tell the US public that what they're doing is useful. People have wondered why, oh my gosh, why is it that everybody in the news media seems to want World War III? It's been amazing in both the Afghanistan, the withdrawal from Afghanistan and this Ukraine issue, just how bloodthirsty and eager for US military involvement all US media seems to be. Well, that's because the Pentagon pays for it. It's not quite that direct, but it is in fact. This money that we give to the Pentagon, a lot of it makes its way out into the ether to make us want to give more money to the Pentagon. It's a marketing budget. Anyway, I've ranted long enough. So that was 10 reasons why the Pentagon budget is completely insane. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. Please comment. Let me know what you think in the comments. And rant over. Thanks.